Our capacity to be curious is such an amazing thing. I don't think it gets said enough by me, at least, but if people are not curious, I do not have a podcast. Curiosity is indeed the very thing that fuels What Magic Is This? This podcast you are listening to right now, and everything that I do on the Patreon. Curiosity is my bread and butter. It's how I make a living. And I can't think of another place where there is more curiosity than the climes and the realms in which I find myself for this podcast. That's magic and the occult, the esoteric, the paranormal, the supernatural, and the weird. These realms are, dare I say, murky at best and intimidating for people who come at this knowing very little about it. And so I've been able to create a little niche for myself, at least within the magical podcast world, in which people can have their curiosity not explained or answered, but at least to have their curiosity expanded by the episodes that I release. But I will say one thing about magic and witchcraft and the occult in this day and age, particularly for the Western world. Specifically, I'm talking about, Europe and North America for the most part, is that people's curiosity tends to be, in a way, predictable. And what I mean by this, and particularly for my show, is that I tend to get a lot of emails, and a lot of these emails are asking the same questions. For the most part, and what I used to do was that I would answer each email question that I would get, I would answer it individually. And then I said, you know what? Might just be good to release an episode, a solo episode that just kind of shows people what I think about usually the same kind of questions that they're asking. A good example of this is the how to start doing magic episodes. Up until I released that episode, I got so many emails and questions and direct messages from people being like, how do I start doing magic? How do I start doing magic? I was like, nah. So now I have a place to send people. It's like, hey, great question. I've done an episode on it. Another example is just the very recent UFO episode. Everybody's like, Doug, when are you going to talk about UFOs? What do you think about this? What do you think of disclosure? What's happening? So here at UFOs, this is what I think, and this is why I think they're important. So in a sense, these episodes are a great way of reducing the amount of emails I get from people asking these questions. Why am I bringing this all up? Why is this how I should start an episode? The answer to that is very simple, because this is going to be an episode whereby I hope that by the time the episode concludes, that I no longer get emails asking some of these questions that I get about this one specific topic, because this is a big one. This episode will hopefully address a whole category of emails that I receive. And it is about something which is intrinsically associated with magic and the occult, and has been for centuries of time. And lest I get too far ahead of myself, what kind of questions am I referring to that people are asking that I hope that this episode should put a rest to? Well, the big one is, how can you, Douglas, interact or work with demons? Or are demons real? Do you, Douglas, think demons are real? Doug, do people get possessed by demons? Or the big one, this happens quite often. Somebody will say, I love magic, I want to start doing magic, but I am scared to death of demons. Some variation of these examples of questions that I just brought up, I receive on a near weekly basis. So it's time to do something about it. But here's the thing. Each and every one of us has an idea as to what demons are, or if they exist. In a way, it doesn't matter if there is some kind of objective reality to demons. To take a line from Papa Moore, the one place where demons inarguably exist is in the human mind, where they are real beyond refute in all their malice and monstrosity. So my name is Douglas Batchelor, and you are listening to What Magic Is This? A podcast about magic, the occult, the esoteric, the paranormal, the supernatural, and the weird. It's time for us to talk about demons and infernal spirits. Let's begin by talking about what this show is not going to be about for the most part. It doesn't mean that this show is not going to touch on some of these things, because it will have to. This episode inevitably will touch on some of these things. That they're not going to be the main focus of this episode itself, and that is demonology. So demonology is something fairly specific. I mean, people could argue, but it is fairly specific, and it's the study of demons within religious beliefs, for the most part. And the word has a different meaning these days, and some people will call themselves demonologists these days, strangely. I mean, it's a thing. But this episode is not going to be specifically about the study of demons, nor is it going to be about demonolatry, which is the spiritual practice of worshiping demons, and that demons are kind of the center of their belief system, for the most part, that sort of thing. Nor is it going to be specifically about exorcism and demonic possession. I'm bringing all of these up because potentially there could be What Magic Is This episodes that deal with those three concepts of demon possession, exorcism, demonolatry, and demonology. And particularly, I think I would love to do an episode on demonology at some point. But this episode that you are listening to, I want to focus specifically on the entity that we call demons, or infernal spirits in some magical grimoires. Specifically, the grimoire that brings all the spooky boys to the yard, that is the Ars Goetia in the Lesser Key of Solomon. If you have not listened to the episode that I've already done about the Ars Goetia, or Goetia, I believe my episode is just called Goetia, head there. I also have an episode on nigromancy, which, for those who are unaware or haven't listened to that episode, that is the ritual magic, usually Solomonic magic, that is based around the invocation or evocation of infernal spirits or demons, right? So 2 episodes. If you haven't listened to them, the Goetia episode and the nigromancy episode with Giulio Cesarodi, listen to those first. We go over a lot of really cool stuff in those episodes. And truly, although I'm going to talk about it a little bit more in this episode, in the nigromancy episode, the question as to why work with demons or infernal spirits, we talk about that in that episode. But let's focus on demons and magic, infernal spirits, that stuff. No doubt all of us have come across somebody or something that, when any aspect of magic, the occult, is brought up, be it tarot cards, be it Ouija boards, be it crystals even, that it will be described with the adjective as being demonic. It's all demonic. That these things, those weird-looking cards that have the pictures on it, even though most of the pictures on the thing come from a Christian context, it's kind of really weird, but it's definitely there, and you can't not see it once you actually start to look at these cards and see it. But anyway, those things are tools of the demons. That's how they get you. That's how the demons get their hooks in you, and then you're damned for your soul for all of eternity, right? We've got this, right? And I've got emails, people telling me that what I am doing is trafficking in demons. How dare you, Douglas, have a podcast in which you you trumpet the wiles of demons and their unholy retinue. And what's funny about this is that this has not been happening. This is not a recent thing. This is a very old thing. Magic has been called demonic for a very long period of time. In fact, it was one of those things where, for those of us that find the history of magic to be so fascinating, that two camps seem to have been set up, and the ping-ponging back and forth and discussion that surrounded what constitutes natural, i.e., okay magic from demonic magic, was something that a lot of people did a lot of thinking about. But these days, I hate to say that the nuance is gone pretty much by a large group of people composed of quite a few religions and spiritualities or traditions. Magic is considered demonic. End of discussion. And it is most likely described this way by folks that I'm pretty sure have no idea where demons came from or what demons might actually be. But what is so cool about demons to me, particularly as somebody who has found looking at them and our interaction with demons, not just through things like magic, but through religion, is that the story of these entities is truly the story of Western thought and Western belief systems. I can't think of any other thing that does something like that. That the mere concept of an embodied evil force in the world can, in a way, showcase just how our thoughts on belief have changed through the ages. To tell the story of demons and how we've thought about demons is to tell the story of us. Now, no doubt some of you might be rolling your eyes into the back of your head. Stick with me on this one, because one hopes if I do my job properly, you'll be like, you know what, Doug actually might have a point here. Because it is our curiosity about these forces of embodied evil and misfortune that we see perhaps some of the most basest aspects of ourselves and our story up to the very minute that you're listening to this podcast. So where did demons come from? And again, I should just probably do this. Like, this is going to focus for the most part, in fact, for the entire part, on the Western conceptualizations of demons. So that is also, just to clarify, we're probably going to be staying within Judeo-Christian realms for this one specifically. So things like jinn and shaitan will have to be talked about on an episode, hopefully, that I will do in the not too distant future. So for the most part, the image that you have in your mind of demons as you know them, it is a Mesopotamian inheritance for the most part. That being said, you will come across people that will be like, oh, demons didn't exist in Egypt. Ancient Egypt, there were no demons. From what I understand, and this is a whole kettle of worms, from what I understand, we can say that there were demons in ancient Egyptian culture. It's tough because they didn't have a word that we could be like, oh, they were talking about demons. But there are certainly and definitely entities, kind of like two classes of Egyptian entities that are demons. The biggest difference is, though, is that with these two classes of demons in ancient Egypt, they were a little bit more ambivalent. And a lot of times it depended on the context in which we have evidence for Egyptian demons to be like, oh, okay, that they're talking about agents of chaos. And scholars have actually given names to these two classes. And for the most part, they're called guardians or wanderers. I just love those names. It's specifically the ones that are called quote unquote wanderers, that are the ones that we can equate with what we would consider the Western conceptualization of demons. These ones, they spread illness, they make people go crazy, they cause disease and plagues. They're even kind of it's strange from one of the articles I read, and it's a fascinating one that they're in a way the ones that carry out orders of punishment to human beings. These that from the gods. Everybody knows, the Egyptian gods like Re or Osiris. There's the wanderers that are the ones that mete out punishment to us horrible human beings here on Earth. And so a lot of magic within some parts that we can see in ancient Egypt throughout history was to try and keep these influences of these agents of misfortune at bay. And here's also kind of something pretty cool. Sick, cool. I have to be careful because I say the word sick as in it's fascinating or it's interesting, but we are going to be talking about something that is intrinsically tied to demons throughout this entire episode, which is illness, and the fact that illness is one of the major aspects of demons within the West. And very obviously, this was a big thing in ancient Egypt as well. But these demons, they cannot be destroyed, right? They can be warded off with certain magical rituals and certain magical objects, but they cannot ever be destroyed. As cool as the Guardians, the Wanderers are for our purposes in this episode, as I say, what we conceptualize as demons for the most part comes from Mesopotamia. I guess I should also just mention, as I make my way through this, although we don't have a ton of evidence for it, we are fairly certain that ascribing some kind of entity status to misfortune and illness has been a part of our culture forever. And although it's not a universal, from what we can say, going through every culture that we've studied or that we can study, nevertheless, the vast majority of cultures has something that we would say would be a kind of demon. All right, Mesopotamia, ancient Mesopotamia. We're going to be talking about the Sumerians. I'm hoping folks know who the Sumerians were. Or that Sumer, like earliest known civilization, right? Southern Mesopotamia, early Bronze Ages, right? About 5500 to 1800 BC, right? Long time ago. And because it was a long time ago, and because Mesopotamia is a fairly large place, none of what I'm going to talk about is like standard through every single period of time. But as I say, the story of demons as we know it now, and specifically for some of these early cultures, this goes for ancient Egypt as well. The word demon is a compromise because sometimes when we talk about these entities, particularly ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, they did bad things, but then they could also do good things, right? So they just did stuff. The ancient Mesopotamians, they lived in a world where what we can consider the underworld was not that far away. And that some of the denizens of this underworld, they could leave their underworld and, as a hobby, they can terrorize humans. Most notorious of these demons, what we will call demons, are the Galu or the Galas, I believe is sometimes pronounced as such, and they would come and grab people and they drag you to the underworld with them. And there was a literary artifact that was excavated in Nippur, dated from Old Babylonian. So we're talking 1900 to 1600 BC. And it's called Inanna's Descent. Language is Sumerian, written in cuneiform. It has this to say about this very specific kind of ancient Mesopotamian demon or spirit: that they know no food, know no drink, eat no flower offering, drink no libation. They never enjoy the pleasures of marital embrace, never have any sweet children to kiss. They snatch the sun from a man's knee. The gallows is just one of a series of ancient Mesopotamian demons or agents of misfortune. And because we're talking about something with such a large time scale that goes through a lot of different cultures, be they Sumeria, Akkad, Babylonia, Assyria, Neo Assyria even gets thrown in there, and then eventually Persian. There's a whole lot of these kinds of spirits or entities that, from our eyes looking back, look like demons. But I want people to realize that even with ones that may be recognizable, and let me throw a name out to you because probably some of you know this name, Pazuzu, right? The Exorcist. Do people know what I'm talking about? You know that figurine that a lot of us, if we were to see it or if you were to look up on Google, you'd be like, "Oh yeah, I've seen that before," because it's always brought up in movies as an ancient depiction of a demon. And for good reason too, because yeah, Pazuzu looks a lot like a demon. A lot of the things that Pazuzu was supposed to have done through Sumerian and Akkadian texts that we do have, yeah, it looks like evil. It looks to us like they're doing horrible things. But Pazuzu also does apotropaic things. Pazuzu could be a protector or a spirit slash deity that is able to protect pregnant women from another kind of demon god spirit called Lamashtu. So while Pazuzu, kind of roundly considered to be somewhat demonic, doing bad things, also can keep other demons away. One demon can counter another demon. So early conceptualizations of demons, particularly from this period of time, and I'm talking about ancient Mesopotamia, they're a bit more ambiguous, right? Not out and out evil, not out and out good protective deity. They're kind of their own things, a lot of them. Also, very early on, the idea of illness and maladies were associated with spirits. And so, if one had a certain kind of illness, we have evidence that a way in which this was dealt with was one would build a pit, make a pit, and then there would be flour, a kind of wheat flour known as atta. And then the pit would be consecrated with this flour and obviously with a kind of priest, magician, doctor helping you with this whole process. Oh, yeah. And the pit, small. I'm not talking about a giant pit. It'd be a somewhat small pit. And then the person who was ill, you'd make an effigy out of wax and clay, tallow, and then you would also have effigies of either witches or the demon or spirit, whatever is causing the illness. And you basically have a ritual wherein you ask the spirit that's causing the illness or the demon causing the illness to take this effigy as a substitute, and they'd say, like myself, his flesh is like the appearance of my flesh. I have mixed clay from the pure mountains, tallow and wax. I have made a representation of him. And then there would be food given inside this pit, and you'd say, "Eat this, you are my substitute. Drink, you have been provisioned. A dowry has been given to you. You have been completely fitted out as my substitute." And then at this point, the magician or doctor slash priest, whoever was doing the ritual themselves, they would say, "All right, the demon has now entered into the substitute, the clay wax effigy," and they would actually take a separate clay figure of an adversarial demon. Remember what I was talking about earlier, how demons can counter other demons, and it would be placed within the pit, and they do battle. So this has been described by the author Heather Lynn in her book, Evil Archaeology, Demons, Possession, and Sinister Relics, as a kind of demonic rock'em sock'em robots. And I think it's pretty spot on. It's a good description of this sort of interaction. It's kind of fun, actually. In a way, I want to try this. Truly, I do. And yet, once again, I do want to reiterate that at this point, through these different cultures of ancient Mesopotamia, this hugely active and vibrant spirit ecosystem, the moral ambiguity of demons or these deities, these spirits, these, in a way, gods, was unclear. They were not good, they were not bad. Some of the things that they would do would be certainly comprehended by us as being evil or bad, but also other things they would do would be like, oh, that's very good. As mentioned earlier, one of the cultures that this was the case was Babylonia, or the Babylonians, which was in southern Mesopotamia, which is now basically kind of smack dab in the middle of Iraq. There was another culture in and around the area known as Canaan. A large part of these would have been a bit more tribal. And while these tribes would have certainly believed in spirits and kinds of spirits, which they would have been influenced by ancient Chaldea, compared to other cultures like the Neo-Babylonian culture and the Assyrians before them, the population of entities that we would call demons or malevolent spirits was comparatively very low. We are now talking about the ancient Israelites. But following the Jewish Babylonian War and the destruction of the Temple of Solomon, which is something I will touch on a bit further on up the line, if you're unaware of Solomon's Temple, please listen to my episode with Alexander Eth from Glitch Bottle on Solomonic magic. And in and around 582 BCE, we have what is known as the Babylonian captivity or the Babylonian exile of the Judeans. So the Jews were being kept captive by the Babylonians. They were not allowed to be where they normally are. That's Judea. And no doubt the Judeans were being highly influenced by the spiritual ecosystem in which they found themselves in Babylonia, but that would all change. In and around 586 BC, what happened is that the Achaemenid Persian Empire, led by Cyrus the Great, who is, in my opinion, one of the most compelling figures in all of ancient history. I've talked about ancient Persia quite a bit on my Patreon, but I just find the Persian Empire to be so fascinating. Anyhow, what occurred is that after Cyrus the Great basically took over Babylonia, is that he allowed the Judeans to return to Judea. So they did. And they took with them quite a lot of the things from Mesopotamia, including many aspects of the very unique spiritual ecosystem of the area itself. So, in summary, early Jewish belief in what we could call demons was fairly slight, and then there was a Babylonian captivity, and then once released from the Babylonians, a whole host of spiritual entities and creatures becomes part of the Judean spiritual ecosystem. It has been described as an explosion. But something else happens, something very important, that in and around Mesopotamia, several cultures with their religious beliefs and religious traditions started incorporating this idea of chaos versus order, as we would probably understand it, although it might be a gross simplification. It is good versus evil. And this became involved within the spiritual ecosystem of the Judeans as well. So what we get is a kind of dualism. And this dualism became a dominant factor in Jewish demonology. So what we get is that we have very present in extant Jewish literature in and around the 3rd century BCE that demons, or what we would call demons, are definitely present within Judaism. And although a lot of this, and a lot of what I will talk about over the next little while is hugely contentious and people are still arguing and debating about it to this day, is that the hypothesis is, and the seeming scholarly consensus, is that because of Zoroastrianism and the interaction between the Jewish peoples and the Persians and Medes, we now have entities that look to our Western eyes now as being demons. And while I do not have time to go through every single one of the examples of what we could call Jewish demons, I will talk about one of them because I do find them somewhat fascinating, although there is also debate as to whether we could call them demons. And I'm going to focus for a little bit on the Shadim. And while the Hebrew Bible doesn't have a lot to say about them, there are other sources that we have that certainly talk about the Shadim, which to our 21st century eyes look a little demon-ish. I just want to say that most likely the Shadim were a known entity before the Babylonian exile. But with translation of Hebrew literary texts into Greek, and also with this idea of dualism, hand in hand, the term Shadim was translated as demonia, which sound a whole lot like demon, don't it? The origins of the Shadim are a little bit iffy. There's quite a few explanations as to what they can be. For the most part, one of the things that I do find very interesting about the Shadim is that they were not considered evil per se, but they were looked on as being the gods and the spirits of foreigners or things that existed outside of Judaic belief. What's interesting again is that the connotation as to whether they are evil or good is somewhat up in the air. It is possible that the word shadim came from the Akkadian word shedu, which is a sometimes but lesser used word for a male lamasu, which is a protective spirit in Mesopotamia. Surrounding the Shadim are many legends as to their origins, but as far as a textual evidence that we have from the Hebrew Bible, they're brought up twice, once in Psalms and another in Deuteronomy. The textual instances where Shadim are brought up are a little bit, well, they're kind of intense. They usually have to do with child sacrifice or human sacrifice to the Shadim. The word Moloch also tends to get put here as well. Moloch probably is less so an entity and more so just the act of sacrifice of human beings. But the capabilities of Shadim themselves are pretty interesting. They cause sickness, they cause misfortune. They're also equated with the dead in some way. The Talmud says that they have some of the traits of angels and some traits of humans, but that they don't have a body. They still experience hunger and thirst. But there's this also conception that occurs a little bit later on that they're only doing the bidding of God and that they are the agents of his divine wrath. What I find most interesting about the Shadim is the description of their feet. Yes, there is something that you will come across when one looks into the demonology of many religions and traditions as well, from early Mesopotamian straight through to Zoroastrian, straight through to Judaism and Christianity, is the feet of a lot of things described as being demons now. Their feet are bird-like. They're either rooster talons or eagle hawk talons. They have the feet of birds, and I know a lot of us, when we think of demons or even say something like the devil, we think of goat hooves and things of that variety. That's a little bit later on, but for the most part, it comes up over and over again in depictions of spirits that we could say are agents of misfortune or demonic. There's a 579 Zoroastrian sarcophagus in which this entity has bird feet. It's surmised that this entity itself is what is called a yazata, which is a kind of a psychopomp in a way, which would be reasonable given that it was on a sarcophagus. Oh, did I mention that the sarcophagus was found in China in 2003? Anyhow, can't say specifically that this entity on the sarcophagus was what we would call quote unquote a demon, but it's very curious that this idea of death and having feet that would belong to a rooster or some kind of bird or fowl, something like that. Again, it comes up so often and say things like the Burnley relief. I hope people know what I'm talking about when I say the Burnley relief, and as well as depictions of Pazuzu and Lamashtu. Anyhow, I just bring all of this up to say it's very interesting that this is such a long tenured trope when looking at spiritual entities that we can call demons, that the feet of birds seems to be something that is just part of the depictions, the artistic representations of these entities themselves. Suffice it to say, the opinions of the existence or non existence of demons within Judaism is hotly contested still to this day. It's something that people will argue about and throw things back and forth. It's interesting, it's a little bit frustrating. In the show notes to this episode, I'll have a link to Dr. Justin Sledge, my guest for the Jewish magic episode that I did a few years ago. He's got some fantastic videos about early Israelite demonology, as well as what had occurred after the Babylonian exile. Well worth watching. There's just tons of videos that he has on demonology. It's so great to watch. His YouTube channel, Esoterica, if you have not heard of Esoterica, you better learn yourself real quickly because Dr. Sledge's work there is beyond essential if this kind of thing is interesting to you. He's really quite fantastic at laying out how these things came about. It's just such a wonderful job. So please head there to get this further fleshed out because I got to keep moving on with the demons. There's so much to talk about. But yes, there's kind of demons within the rabbinic literature, within the Talmud tradition, within Kabbalah, in Second Temple Judaism, Midrash, you name it. There's very interesting entities there, well worth looking into. Which brings us to Christianity, and for the most part, because we're here in the West, and for the most part, the societies here, depending on which country you're in, are based around Christian thought for the most part. So demons within Christianity love themselves some demons. Oh, just love them. The background of early Christian demonology was in both Hebrew and Greek culture. No doubt, if you have been around for even a short little while in the magic, occult, esoteric world, you will understand that there is another word that sounds like demon, but is spelt differently, and it's Daimon, daimon. You'll also see spelling sometimes Daemon. They're kind of like guiding spirits for the most part. The name, I believe, translates to the divider. And they had a whole range of functions and explanations and all of that kind of thing. I don't want to get into it too much, but it's more in line with, that ancient Egyptian idea, as well as you can see evidence of this within something like the Greek magical papyri, where they're like intermediaries between man and gods, right? So I don't want to dwell on it too much because how do we go from daimon to demon? It gets complex, but in short, from what I can see, and just to make it easier for everybody, Augustine of Hippo, theologian, philosopher, Saint Augustine. Now we're talking about 4th to 5th century AD. Wrote a book of Christian philosophy called The City of God, which is an enormously influential book. And I would urge everybody who's interested in magic, and particularly magic that comes from a Christian basis, to know about the City of God. Basically, in this book, at one point, where the idea of diamonds being not just like a state of being in between, but an actual being, particularly through Hesiod, the ancient Greek poet. In Augustine's City of God, he says this: the gods worshipped by pagan Egypt, Greece, and Rome had all been demons who misrepresented themselves to humans. And in all people that would call on things like gods or intermediary entities, these things were demons. Some people might be screaming at me right now. That's a very, very short, succinct explanation for how this happened, but I will have in the show notes the link to an essay, From Daemon to Demon, The Evolution of the Demon from Antiquity to Early Christianity. Go give it a read. It definitely lays it out much better than I did this last minute or so. But something else happened from getting daemon to demon that is very important to demons within Christianity, which is when the Hebrew Bible was translated into Greek. Some stuff happened. Remember, I said somehow that the Shadim were considered gods of other people's religions? This othering of other deities into demons is something that also happened within language. So when the Hebrew Bible was translated into Greek, this infamous gods of other nations, they became a single category of false gods, which then became associated with the Greek word daemon. And because adoration of gods besides the one god was looked at as being deleterious, daemon become demon. That being said, before the translation of the Hebrew Bible into Greek, this is known as the Septuagint, otherwise known as the Greek Old Testament. Before this, there's no demons in the Old Testament. Or I should be more specific, there's no entities or spirits that we can point to within the Old Testament that is like that would be a demon. All right? So the Old Testament not looking too great for demons. But then we get the Gospels. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, as well as the other books that consist of what we now know and call the New Testament. This is, within the Bible, this is all of the Jesus stuff, okay? And demons, they pop up something fierce through these 55 times. 46 times they are mentioned as possessing people, that thing that we all know that demons like to do. And I know a lot of people don't read the Bible anymore, so a lot of people will not have a Bible in front of them. If they do, if you look at how much of that Bible is the Old Testament compared to the New Testament, you'll notice that it's like 3/4 or 4/5 of that is the Old Testament, and then there's the paltry New Testament. It's like a very small section of the Bible. But yeah, lots of demons in that last little part there in that New Testament. As far as the demons within the Gospels or the New Testament, their origin is not clear. The King James Bible translates the word demon into devil instead. At least some of the earlier King James Bibles did this. But as far as our current contemporary conception of demons, it pretty much all comes down to the New Testament and the Gospels as to what demons do. They are not as a lot of, how I talked about at the beginning of this episode, how tarot cards are temptations put out by demons, and things of that variety. New Testament demons, they don't have to tempt shit. They are the cause of evil and suffering and pain and illness and death. They are the adversaries of Jesus. And they love us humans because they like to take us over all the time. Them demons enjoy a really good human skinwalking. And in the New Testament, as I said, 46 times there is reference to demonic possession and then exorcisms. And sometimes it's just the name of Jesus that will have the demons jump out of the person that they're possessing. So with the accumulation of all of the Mesopotamian to Judaic heritage, eventually into Christianity, and this conception of demons that goes pretty much all the way up to how we view demons today. But early in Christianity, why was this being there? And a lot of times there's explanations. The scholarly consensus seems to be that it just demonstrates the divinity of the power of the Christ figure, that his name can be one which can cause evil of these spirits and their afflictions and their powers to be exorcised or to be gotten rid of. That's how powerful this figure of Jesus Christ is. But what we also have here is the idea, and it's very much the one that we have now, that they're kind of invisible, that you don't get to see demons, that they're aerial spirits for the most part. And if they were corporeal in any way, their bodies were air or wind. But something happens also in early Christianity, and particularly from the New Testament, in which when Satan is referred to as the lord or king of demons, the story of the devil, in air quotes there, gets put together with the idea of the fallen angels or the group of angels which rebelled against God and all of the mythology that gets wrapped up in that. It gets very complex. I'm not going to bring it up here, although I will say that part of that story of the fallen angels or the rebel angels involves them teaching mankind things like using metal, the use of herbs, and frankly, magic and witchcraft. And these angels, in turn, lusted after human females, and they had children, and these children were known as the Nephilim. And so some of the early church fathers, particularly the Greek church fathers, said that the demons are the ghosts of the Nephilim that have been wiped out by God in that great flood. Much of this is attested to in a book that also everybody should read if magic and the occult is interesting to you within a Christian context, which would be the Book of Enoch. Suffice to say, Christianity, particularly early Christianity, and its adherence to bringing up these entities, these demons, was foundational to the nascent religion that we know as Christianity today. It's hard to think of a time, though, when Christianity was not as monolithic as it is nowadays. So things like demons, they constituted a kind of social threat to the early Christians, and they were often associated with the public opponents of Christianity and Christians themselves. And so what you get, and very, very early on within Christianity, a study of the importance, the origin, and the theological implications of the reality of demons within Christianity started to grow. And it has been a process that continues in some small way to this day. And this is what, for the most part, these days we talk of as demonology. But more specifically, it is Christian demonology. And unfortunately, it is not the focus of our episode. Not yet, at least. I would love to do an episode on Christian demonology because it is very fascinating. And the history of it and the implications of the study of demons within a Christian context is something that is intrinsically linked to Western magic and occult traditions. For the most part, the early conceptualization of demons and what they were capable of has been pretty much almost the same since the New Testament. Again, these are agents of evil. They exist. They are, for the most part, invisible. They can take possession of human bodies. They are just generally evil spirits. For the most part, that stayed relatively static until we get to, obviously, the Enlightenment and rationalist values and positivism. Demons started to be less and less of an issue for Western societies. In fact, most somewhat rational materialistic societies, particularly here in the West, say that there's no such thing as demons whatsoever. But for those who still believe in demons, for the most part, they tend to toe the Christian party line. And any trip to YouTube and to the search bar there, looking up the capacity of demons, it's pretty sad, I'm going to say. Demons and who they have possessed and what groups of people they have possessed and the capabilities of demons. It's truthfully a bit lame. I think a lot of these people are very sincere in their belief that the demonic is a real force within the world these days. But it's one of those things where demons are basically within the eye of the beholder, and they're used to basically tar as an epithet for anything that anybody does not like, given any kind of belief system that they hold to be sacrosanct. I would be negligent in my duties if I did not mention that over the last 250 years, but even more specifically, since the advent of film and television, the role of the demon as antagonists for storytelling, given these mediums, has just been quite incredible. From things very much off the top of our heads, something like The Exorcist, which truly probably did more for getting the idea of demons into the heads of post-war West than any other piece of artwork. Demons are such an easy go-to for storytelling when one basically wants to have an embodied evil within their story. Very few people are familiar with the origins of the Mesopotamian inheritance of these kinds of spirits, and even fewer are aware of the early Christian conceptualization of demons and what they were most likely added to the story of the New Testament. Most people that talk about demons these days are taking their cue from popular culture, film and television and books. And for the most part, the aim as well as the goals of these spirits is the same. They're evil, therefore they do evil things. Surely there has got to be a better way to conceptualize spirits that perhaps have some kind of moral ambiguity to them. Perhaps they're not all just evil. Well, lucky for everyone else, we have magic and the occult. And what we can do, despite the fact that everybody considers what we do to be demonic, what we can do is certainly add some much needed nuance to the conversation around demons and infernal spirits. So let's talk about one of my favorite things in the world to talk about. And trust me, if you ever get me in a social situation or something like that, and you start asking me about demons and magic, I will talk at you for about 3 hours straight. So I'm going to try and restrain myself a little bit here. Let's talk about demons in magic. So first of all, we have to acknowledge that about 2,500 to 2,000 years ago, a lot of magical traditions, be they Jewish magic, be they Greco-Egyptian magic, or just Egyptian magic in general, the sorts of magic that people would do would be one in which there would be beings or spiritual creatures or entities that one would ask to have things done in the name of the person who is doing the magic. They were intermediaries between the divine and the person doing the magic itself. You look at the PGM, this is a huge part of what is going on there. And it's a very good example to look at the PGM, obviously. And the reason I myself and a lot of scholars use the Greek magical papyri as evidence is that it's so cool because of the syncretic blending of Jewish and Egyptian and Greek spiritualities, and in a way, I'm definitely going to include this, a lot of the Jewish influences as well certainly have that Babylonian, Mesopotamian influence as well. So in this crazy cauldron of magic, we can start to see that there are certain kinds of magic that rise to the top, and the process of how this magic is done becomes somewhat relevant for us who look at the history of magic. So with all that said, I'm going to start, for the most part, with demons and magic by bringing up something that is tabled by the good doctor. And I'm talking about Dr. Stephen Skinner. I've talked about him a bunch of times on this podcast, but in his book, Techniques of Solomonic Magic, which in my opinion, and I'm pretty sure I've said this before, in my opinion, Techniques of Solomonic Magic is one of the most important releases within magical studies over the last 30 years, at least. So what I'm going to talk about a little bit here has been ripped wholesale from Techniques of Solomonic Magic, but I have to bring it up because it is germane to what we are talking about today, or what I am talking at you about today. Everybody, please go buy yourself a copy of Stephen Skinner's Techniques of Solomonic Magic. All right, here we go. Let's start with some of the observations of a Neoplatonist. In fact, a Neoplatonist who was the student of the grand poobah of Neoplatonism, Plotinus. Plotinus. I know, stop writing me. The Neoplatonist in question goes by the name of Iamblichus. They were a Arab Neoplatonic philosopher. A lot of our ideas of theurgy come from Iamblichus. As I've mentioned, I'm not a huge fan of Neoplatonism, particularly its manifestation through things like Hermetic Kabbalah and things of that variety. But what I will say is that I like what Iamblichus has to offer. I think that as far as the Neoplatonists, he's the one that I think more people should look at and look at what they have to say about this whole thing. Anyways, our dude Iamblichus was born in 245 AD and died in 325. He was about 80 years old or so. Long life back then, but one of his treatises, and I'm probably going to pronounce this wrong, but De Mysteries, there's two I's in there, which alternatively goes by the title translated into English, On the Mysteries of Egypt, but that is actually even shortened from its true title when translated, which is On the Mysteries of the Egyptians, Chaldeans, and Assyrians. Just so you know, there's a little bit of that Mesopotamian spice in there as well. This book and its ideas very influential on Renaissance magicians, those like Cornelius Agrippa, as well as Marsilio Ficino, Giordano Bruno even. That being said, there is some folks who wonder if Iamblichus did truly write this, although what we can assert is that it comes from his school, or perhaps it was written by one of Iamblichus's students. Doesn't matter. The contents of this book are very interesting. Talks about the soul and gods, ritual, sacrifice, symbolism, and also talks about gods, archons, angels, daimons, heroes, pure souls. And then there's this other class of spirit that doesn't really have a name, and it's this unnamed spirit class, which interests Dr. Stephen Skinner. He goes on to say that they are described as another class of being from among those which surround us, devoid of reason and judgment, which has been allotted just one power in the apportionment of tasks which has been prescribed for each entity in each parts of the universe. So that's curious, but he goes on to say, there exists a certain class of powers in the cosmos, limited, devoid of judgment, and highly irrational, which are capable of receiving and obeying rational instruction from another, but neither has any understanding of its own, nor distinguishes what is true or false, or what is possible or impossible. It is such a class that is at once stirred up and startled when threats are brandished at them, since, it seems to me, it is in their own nature to be led by appearances and to be influenced by other things through a foolish and unstable imagination. So that is indeed very curious that for those who back in the day were doing certain rituals of magic that they noticed, and this is what most likely Iamblichus and his students started to hone in on, particularly as ritual was a very active component of Iamblichus's Neoplatonism, that there seemed to be some kind of an entity which weren't gods or daemons that can do tasks as long as they were asked in the appropriate way with appropriate measures. From where we're sitting now with what we know about things like Solomonic magic, this indeed seems very interesting. So let's keep that little tidbit in the back of our minds and continue, because the story of demons in magic also is tied very heavily to something that I have talked about a couple of times on this podcast, and I continue to bring it up. And that has to do with magic that is done in the name of and takes the name from King Solomon. If you are unfamiliar with the story of King Solomon, I would ask you and urge you to go back and listen to the very first episode that I did with Alexander Eth of Glitch Bottle Podcast, An Introduction to Solomonic Magic. because we go through it a little bit there. I'm going to touch on it here as well because I have to. Now, there are, of course, legends that occur before a document that I'm going to talk about. One of them being specifically the 4th century Byzantine historian Zosimus, who lived in Constantinople, mentions that there are demons in jars below the temple in Jerusalem, and that this was known by the Egyptians as well, and that the Egyptians would put demons into jars also. But without a doubt, the one place, particularly within the West, where the ideas of demons and magic going hand in hand, and that one of the techniques that a magician or a witch has available to them is to summon and evoke these quote unquote spirits, infernal spirits or demons, comes from this document known as the Testament of Solomon. And most likely, this had existed in some kind of a storytelling fashion or as legends or things of that nature well before the 1st century AD. It was originally written in the Greek language. There is much debate around the dating of when this was first composed, whether it was composed by somebody who was Christian or it was Jewish in origin. We've talked about it before, but it is indeed an extremely fascinating document in which, well, it starts out a little bit weird because King Solomon in it talks about one of the children, one of the boys of one of the chief devisers of his infamous temple, again, Solomon's temple, the story of which is massively important in Western culture. You should probably know about Solomon's temple. Anyhow, this boy that King Solomon loves, kind of creepy. Moving on, King Solomon's like, "Why are you growing thin? What's happening? Why do you look so sickly?" And the little boy says to him and tells them that there is a demon that comes along towards sunset, and this demon takes not only the food and the life vitality from this boy by sucking the thumb of his right hand, but also the pay. This demon takes money. I mean, how rude. You can take my life vitality, but you can't take my cash. That is truly demonic, taking somebody's money. Anyhow, this document, and I'm not going to talk about it too much, but it is basically retelling the story of how the temple built by Solomon, but it was with the assistance of Solomon's control via a magical ring given to him by the archangel Michael. And that with this ring, with throwing it almost Pokemon esque at the chest of a demon named Ornias, and it goes, "Ah, you got me." And then that demon Ornias uses the ring and does the same thing, Pokemon esque, very Pokemon like, and throws it at another demon by the name of Beelzebub, right? I'm pretty sure all of us know that name. Sorry, it's in the actual Testament of Solomon, it's Beelzebul. And then what follows is basically the listing of all of these demons and how they can be banished or thwarted with certain words or even with mentioning archangels or angels. But this section of the Testament of Solomon is where pretty much almost all of the Solomonic magic that deals with evocation of infernal spirits or demons, it basically, for the most part, comes from this. There's a couple of outliers, but for the most part, this is it. The Testament of Solomon has it. It ends on a very strange note, and I'm only bringing it up because there's another word that I talked about a little bit earlier that comes up in the Testament of Solomon, which is it ends in Solomon basically saying that his downfall was because he wanted to have sex with a woman, and in order to do this, he had agreed to worship deities, in this case, foreign deities, and this would be Rephaim and Moloch. So there's that word Moloch again, remember? Tied in with the Shadim, right? And so he agrees to sacrifice to them, and he takes locusts and he crushes them in his hand. And when he does this, the Spirit of God, it leaves him. He's no longer a holy king. And yeah, it's it's so strange. It ends with him basically being like, "Don't don't abandon the things that you hold to be sacred for sex." Right? It's a weird one. Interesting also within the Testament of Solomon is the fact that there are demons of the 36 spirits of the Decans. The Decans are originally Egyptian, uh, 36 groups of stars, which divide the 360-degree ecliptic into 36 groups of 10 degrees, right? 360, full circle, 10 degrees each. That's 36. But yeah, the demons originally very tied in with a very old system of astrology from ancient Egypt. And as the books of Solomonic magic or the Solomonique continue through time, the astrological associations of these so-called demons or infernal spirits, that just starts to fall away. So that's something that's very, very curious. Originally, the demons within magic or within the Testament of Solomon were a bit more astrological. But yes, the story of King Solomon using the assistance of demons and his capacity to be able to evoke them and contain them, sometimes even in vessels, in most cases, water vessels. This mythology, this story, these tales, these legends are central to Western magic. And they do not exist without the idea of what we can call demons. As far as the Testament of Solomon itself, the importance of this text cannot be understated, as even some of the more early proto claviculas or keys of Solomon, in which there is evocation of spirits, be they infernal or otherwise, sometimes, and I'm talking about a specific grimoire or kind of grimoire called the Hygromantia, the Magical Treatise of Solomon. A lot of times, those books, which are instruction manuals that have rituals of evocation of spiritual entities, specific angels of the hour and demons of the hour, and the angel constrains the demon, very, very much like the Testament of Solomon. Sometimes those manuals for magical operations to do that kind of evocation were bundled together with actual copies of the Testament of Solomon. Very, very important. What's interesting though, if you read things like the Magical Treatise of Solomon, the demons, for the most part, aren't what we would kind of consider like the evil demons that we all know, right? Their powers are not really very terrifying or evil. As an example, there's a very specific demon listed in the Hygromantia, Magical Treatise of Solomon, that when you evoke it by stabbing a black-handled dagger into a table for which you have set a feast for this specific demon, you just basically ask it, like, don't come in here and shit all over the place, right? It's like you're inviting over a toddler or a poorly trained puppy or something like that. Demons prior to the 11th century and pretty much prior to most of the grimoires that we will use that have infernal spirits in them, they're they're kind of dumb in that way that Iambalicus was talking about, is that they're not overly crafty. They're not there to tempt human beings in that Saint Anthony kind of way. It's not until later on that their cunning and their deception becomes an attribute of demons within magical texts. Early grimoires like the Hygromantia, they're seemingly just like another entity, kind of like an operant force that is able to help the magician when they use certain protocols. What you will notice, particularly when there are grimoires that have been translated into English, a lot of times, this isn't the case for every single one of them, but a lot of times, these spirits that, you can evoke and then have them do certain tasks for you or things of that nature. They're called spirits or infernal spirits. Not so often will it actually have the name demon in there. So remember when I was talking about the Book of Oberon? There's a part in there called the Office of the Spirits. They're they're referred to as spirits, but very evidently, when you go through the list of these spirits, you'll recognize, there's Paimon or Lucifer or Beelzebul, things like that. And it's like, oh, so those are those are very obviously what has been classified as being demons. And of course, when one goes through a lot of grimoires that have lists of spirits on there, list of infernal spirits or spirits that we can kind of like, that's fairly demonic for the most part, the names will be recognizable because they come from traditions outside of Christianity, things like Judaism. A lot of times the names will look as though they have been taken from stories out of the Old Testament. Asmodeus being a huge one. I could probably do a whole Patreon episode about Asmodeus. Anyhow, just note a lot of the times the names that are applied within a lot of these grimoires, the spirit itself has almost literally nothing to do with the legends or tales of those names specifically, right? But the thing that I want people to understand more than any other thing here, because of the centrality of demons and their capabilities, as well as how the Christian world conceptualized demons being central to Western magic, if one looks at things like books which have, or manuals that have the evocation of spirits. Sometimes these things get labeled as Solomonic. A lot of times the rituals and the protocols or the ritual scripts all seem fairly similar. There is a seeming kind of protocol between a lot of these Solomonic grimoires or books of magic. The question becomes, where did this ritual script come from? Where did these protocols come from? I'm going to read a little bit here from Peter Gray essay, Peter Gray being one of the founders of Scarlet Imprint. They publish some of the absolute best books about magic available today. He has this great essay called The Submerged Word, Conversing with Demons. This is what he has to say. So where did the grimoires get their ritual scripts, their conjurations? The academics have definitely answered this. The bald fact is that the conjurations in the grimoires are drawn from Byzantine and Catholic exorcism manuals. This is the history of the grimoires that magicians tend not to emphasize. It is uncomfortable to admit that the techniques of our magic books, though we can draw more comforting parallels with the Greek magical papyri, are more fundamentally Christian exorcisms. If this variety of magic is interesting to you, I would like you to sit with that for a second. Peter is absolutely right. For the most part, the reason that these things are similar is not so much that it is part of a from the ground up tradition of magic, but more so that these were cribbed wholesale from those who truly believed that human beings were being possessed by demons. Now, who exactly were doing these exorcisms and in what capacity and to what extent is something that I will definitely cover in an exorcism and demonic possession episode a little bit further on down the line for this podcast. Unfortunately, I can't go into it for this one. But as far as magic is concerned, I hope the implications are quite clear. Now then the question becomes, are the demons that are talked about in the New Testament the same as the demons or the spirits that are in the grimoires? And that is something that, it's hard to answer if there even is an answer at all. And in this case, it's all just going to be opinion and speculation. But the things that are interesting about demons in magic is the same thing that Stephen Skinner talks about, and then I brought up a little bit here, this class of spirit that one can evoke through many, many manuals of magic throughout the centuries seem to go back to one thing, that these spirits, whatever they are, these infernal spirits, seem to respond to certain protocol and seem to do things which are, to our eyes, fairly terrestrial and fairly simplistic. What occurs eventually is that the variety of magic that this would adhere to begins to get labeled with the epithet of being demonic in some way. And there is this somewhat century-long debate that goes back and forth as to what is the difference between natural magic and demonic magic. We're looking at the 15th, 16th century or so. What is the magic that can be called good as opposed to the magic that can be called bad? And what has occurred, because what we do quite a bit is look back with rose-tinted glasses, is that we see this distinction where there wasn't so much one back in the day. And particularly with the privileging of, let's just call it the superstars of ceremonial magic, people like John Dee, we think that that is, for the most part, the norm, when in fact, when we look back through time, and at least looking at the evidence we have of people who were copying these grimoires and the notebooks of actual operant magicians, boy howdy, they were doing the demonic magic far more than the other stuff, particularly in the period of time that we like to call the Middle Ages. Of course, this gives me an opportunity to bring up something that I think, if this sort of thing is interesting to you as a magician or just somebody curious in this kind of stuff, you have to read a book called The Transformations of Magic, Illicit Learned Magic in the Later Middle Ages and Renaissance by Frank Clausen. One of my favorite books. It's so great. I'm going to read you a little bit from it here. You ready? This is a big quote. And also, by the way, remember that people that engaged in this kind of magic, they were called necromancers, despite the fact a lot of times their magic didn't deal with the dead. The term that I've been trying to steer people towards, as far as this kind of magic is concerned, is nigromancy. Again, I did a whole episode about nigromancy with Julio Cesar Odi, so when the term necromancer comes up, just know that they're doing nigromancy, not necromancy. And also, as far as this quote that I'm going to share, it's talking about what we would roundly consider to be like the high point of ritual magic within Europe. That's, 3 books of occult philosophy, that sort of stuff. The kind of stuff that the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn looks back at and being like, that's ritual magic. That was the magic. All right, here we go. Here's the quote. A tendency to regard the magic of the 16th century as the product of new currents of thought and to accept Renaissance writers' disavowal of medieval magic at face value has also led to a selective approach to the sources. A significant body of evidence has remained almost entirely unexamined. Historians have focused on the high points of 16th century occultism, such as Ficino, Pico della Mirandola, Cornelius Agrippa, and John Dee, whose works may be demonstrated with varying degrees of success to promote natural magic. Those that do not correspond to the learned magic of the great Renaissance mages are summarily dismissed as remnants of a bygone era. As a little dug aside here, they're referring to those who practice nigromancy and treasure hunting and things of that variety. All right, back to Frank Clausen. In marked contrast to this assumption, we find a vast literature of ritual magic in 16th century hands, the overwhelming bulk of practical magic literature in manuscript. In addition to the low magic of the necromantic tradition, this library continues to include the high magic of the Ars Notoria and the Sworn Book of Honorius, and continued to appeal to an educated audience. In addition, as in previous centuries, this literature treats natural magic as an adjunct or supplementary art, if it includes it at all. It may be that the reason so little work has been done on 16th century magic collections is the limited amount of material in manuscript that confirms assumptions about the importance of natural magic, Kabbalism, Hermetic sources, and Renaissance Platonism. To be sure, Natural magic continued to be an important part of Renaissance discussions of occult topics, and perhaps the most significant topic in learned discussions of magic. With few exceptions, however, the records of those who actually practiced magic, those who were not just merely employing magical ideas for rhetorical or philosophical purposes, not merely promoting or purchasing magical texts as a curiosity, but engaged enough to copy texts and compose notebooks, tell a different story. There is something to this, I think, and the continued interest that folks have to things like the Grimoire, the Ars Goetia, in which there are 72 infernal spirits. They are literally called infernal spirits in the Grimoire itself. Each demon has a seal. Each demon or infernal spirit has one or two, sometimes three duties, things that they can accomplish if they are evoked. This sort of thing seemingly goes straight to the heart of the Western psyche in some way. And I'm saying psyche not to say that when one engages with something like the Ars Goetia that it's all mental and it's just part of your brain. Remember, Aleister Crowley said most people have a copy of the Ars Goetia that is Aleister Crowley's, and I have said it over and over again, just throw it in the garbage. I mean, it's fun as a curiosity because it's just a fuck you to MacGregor Mathers. Anyways, but this grimoire itself, you can evoke spirits using this grimoire. That's what Giulio Cesare and I talked about. But for the most part, even for people who are not interested in ritual magic, the Ars Goetia and the pictures from the Dictionnaire Infernal, all of you have seen these illustrations. That stuff has seemingly wormed its influence into the sinews of Western society. The story of the demon and the way that they are contextualized through a ritual basis for something that has been going on for nearly 2,000 years is so central to the story of magic. As somebody who has interacted with spirits from many of these grimoires, can I say that they are, to use huge air quotes, demons? I cannot. I do not know what they are. They seemingly do the things that Iamblichus said that they would do, which is very interesting. But as far as the capacity to be terrifying, and I have been terrified while in a ritual process, at no point would I say that the experience led me to believe that it is the same thing that Christian demonology has espoused about the capabilities of these spirits. So while others will continue to call these entities, particularly the ones that form a basis of evocation through the grimoires that I have on my bookshelf, demons, I just still prefer to call them that thing that I have no idea what they are, but they seemingly are there. They're spirits, a seemingly specific kind of spirit. That's all. The spirits that I interact with seem so utterly different than the contemporary conception of demons. One of the reasons I enjoy having a podcast, and particularly why I enjoy doing these solo shows, is I'm on my own. So I have to do a lot of my own research. I've got a pretty, substantial library here at home, but I also have to kind of go outside the library sometimes and go out into the world and find other books. And there is a book that I found for this episode that just I had to read the whole thing. It was an astonishing book. It was infuriating. It was insane. It was confounding, but it was incredibly compelling and probably for not the right reasons. But what you do get from reading this book is, without a doubt, the current conceptualization of demons in a post-exorcist world. And the reason I say post-exorcist is because, I truly think that The Exorcist blew the doors off the hinges as far as the idea of exorcism and demonic possession re-entering the Western psyche. Its influence cannot be overstated. I truly believe that. About 2 years after the release of The Exorcist, in 1975, the Christian Medical Association gathered to deliver papers on the subject of demonic possession at the University of Notre Dame. The essays within this specific book, that was just really weird to read, cover the gamut. It talks about demonic possession within the Bible, in literature, from missionaries out in the quote unquote field, in anthropology, psychiatric treatment. The people who wrote these essays very definitely believed that the demonic is real and it is an active force within our world right now and always has been. The book is called Demon Possession: Papers Presented at the University of Notre Dame. These essays were collected and put into book form by one John Warwick Montgomery. Man, that is a name, isn't it? Who was a lawyer, professor, Lutheran theologian. I will say this dude has some kind of pedigree to him. He's got 11 degrees in multiple disciplines: philosophy, theology, law. Suffice to say, the essays in this book, when one compares the things that were put forward through something like The Exorcist, is astounding. It's one of those books where I don't want to talk too much about it because if this sort of thing is interesting to you, and eventually, yes, I do, again, want to do an episode on demonic possession and exorcisms. Basically, every single essay has this like conclusion. I'm going to share one of these conclusions, but all of them pretty much toe this line. This is from one of the essays within it called Demonism on the Mission Fields by G.W. Peters. It ends with this sentiment: I conclude my study by the affirmation that demonism is real and demon possession is an awful fact. While much mystery surrounds the whole phenomenon, its reality is difficult to deny. Much in so-called occultism, spiritism, and demonism will be explained by further explorations in psychology and psychiatry. However, there is a realm of reality which functions and operates on the level of intelligent personality. There is an intelligent evil in this world. For those who don't know very much about magic or the occult, this would be the sentiment that they would hold against us, to say that we are part of the ones trafficking in this kind of intelligent evil that exists in this world. No matter how much someone like me would try to say, no, these spirits within these books of magic are different than the kind of intelligent evil that you were talking about, I don't think any argument that I would make, no matter how convincing I am and no matter how much evidence, textual, experiential, or otherwise, I could bring forward, would make a convincing argument for those who believe in an evil intelligence in the world. There is that and nothing else. Zero nuance, good, evil, sacred, profane. So the question then becomes, why do I use these manuals or these books of magic and interact with spirits that others call demonic? I can only speak for myself, of course. Again, we did cover this briefly on the episode that I did with Julio Cesar Odi on necromancy. But for one, I don't think that what I am dealing with is the same thing that other people think demons actually are. I think that there is probably something more to do with spirits of dead human beings than so much evil spirits in the kind of magic that I do regarding Solomonic magic and what can be called Goetia. Others, of course, may not share this view, but from my interactions, it's not that they're same, but I think the variety of ritual and how the spiritual ecosystem of wherever I find myself, there are lines of similarity between necromancy and negromancy. So perhaps the confusion between the two terms way back in the day was just a time-saving heuristic. I don't know. What I will say, though, is that I think that the variety of magic has more to do with the sort of spirits which show up than any other factor. In other words, I always think it's about how one approaches these things as opposed to what you think you might be calling. As mentioned earlier, specifically when I'm talking about myself and certain interactions that I've had, some of the more, a term that I use quite often is histrionic interactions have not been through certain grimoires that use infernal spirits, but for the most part have been when I have been interacting with the Greek magical papyri and the rituals within those scrolls or those documents. Like Julio, the force which made me want to try this was skepticism. This is something wherein you can be skeptical about what you are doing and what kind of spirits might show up, and that is a very good place to start from. Going in expecting demons to be all demon like, straight out of some shitty TV show's version of how demons are and what their behavior and capabilities can be, is probably not the best way of going at it. Start as you mean to go. A piece of advice that I always try to share with people that are interested in this form of magic is, for the most part, it seems to be how you bang the door that makes the difference. Not always, just most of the time. You bang the door fearfully, something fearful is probably going to show up. You bang the door angrily, do not be surprised if something angry answers. I myself have that same curiosity with which this episode began. I have the same inquisitiveness about the capabilities of certain spirits in a certain kind of magic, and even just magic in general. Something that I've always said is that learning the history and the supposed origins of certain things is a tool in and of itself, particularly for the magician. So, for all of those who have been listening to this episode that have sent me emails in the vein of asking about demons in general, I hope that somehow this has been, in a way, a small help. Although others would just say that I'm trying to get you to join the legions of the unholy. As I've said time and time again, those who usually try to admonish you, particularly by calling whatever you do in some way as being demonic, have almost zero idea of the story of the demon and how central it is to Western society. Not just Western magic, but Western society in general. How we conceptualize the things which are harmful or misfortune or disease, some of the more baser aspects of our existence on this planet, and giving them an embodiment, handing them a spot on the stage of the play, which is human life, is essential, I think. What's incredible about demons, particularly now, is that because they're so intrinsically tied to perceived evil or negativity, that as seemingly universal as they are within Western society, specifically with their characteristics and their traits, what they are capable of, demons are also deeply personal. So if you were to ask me, do demons exist? I'm not sure if I can answer that. But to take one of their wiles, at least the kind of wiles that they were ascribed within magic after the 11th century, I would say I don't think they exist, but they certainly are real. How much power and agency you give them, though, is, for the most part, a personal volition. And for all of those who still say that doing magic or anything involving the occult, or very definitely specifically the kind of magic in which spirits, be they infernal or otherwise, absolutely scares them to death, that the idea itself is terrifying and fearful. There is help for this. Indeed, there is a book of self help, I would love to recommend to you to help you in this regard. In fact, it is the only self help book that I will probably ever recommend to anyone ever. And I'm so glad that I finally have an episode in which I can share this book. So, if demons, for the most part, as they exist to you in this life now, as tricksters or agents of misfortune, that demons are indeed the personification of all that is problematic within modern living, I have a book for you. This has been a relatively, it's a heavier topic, certainly heavier than UFOs and things of that variety. Generally, I'd say magic and the occult is a fairly, serious thing. And this certainly bears out through books and literature involving magic and the occult. They're also serious all the time, and it's kind of annoying to me, so much so that I usually give some books extra points if in my mind they're funny or charming. And producing clever, funny, charming books about magic is the main hustle of one Ramsey Dukes. And he has produced a book that I would say, if you haven't read it yet, and demons are interesting to you, demons of all stripes, infernal spirits from the magic and otherwise, even those crazy evil ones from the New Testament, all variety of demon, if they're interesting to you, you need to read the only self help book that I will ever recommend, Uncle Ramsey's Little Book of Demons: The Positive Advantages of the Personification of Life's Problems. For Ramsey, demons are very much of our own making, and that means that we have to tangle with them, certainly, and we have to have conversations with them, and we have to ascribe them an agency all their own, but realize that we are also part of the equation. And indeed, it does take two to tango within Uncle Ramsey's Little Book of Demons, but to also realize that others certainly have their own demons. And for the most part, most people do not engage in this kind of an interaction of the personification of these agents of misfortune. Society itself, even, has its demons, and all of these are, within the eyes of Uncle Ramsey, not only worth navigating, but that one should absolutely take glee in doing so. If you yourself have yet to read any books by Ramsay Dukes, otherwise known as Lionel Snell, then perhaps this might be the first one to start with. But apart from the ways in which demons are able to help you in some way by interacting with them in your daily life, what of the magician? How to think with demons as a magician, a ritual, practical magician. Well, for one, I think it would be wonderful to draw your attention to somebody for whom demons were certainly very familiar, and I use that as a pun as well. The late, great Jake Stratton Kent. He has a fantastic essay called The Other Magicians, in which he was starting to talk about how something else which we need to recognize that goes along the same lines of what Peter Gray said earlier in the essay, or the part of the essay I shared earlier called The Submerged Word, that when it comes to grimoires, it's very easy to assume that they already tell the whole story of Western magic and our interactions with these kinds of spirits. That the rituals, particularly from things which are called Solomonic magic, and these ritual practices, or the ritual script of having a knife or a sword and threatening torture on these spirits if they do not obey your word, is indeed how everyone has done it and has always done it. This is very wrong. To quote Jake Stratton Kent, he says, "The grimoires are the literary tip of an iceberg whose submerged portion may well have been very different. Also, the grimoires, most of which are later than the medieval period, reflect magic during its decline rather than its heyday. As a comparison, historians point out that astrologers writing in the 1700s were aware their art was becoming sidelined by new tendencies in Western culture. Stuff starts to happen under these conditions, one of which is gentlemen start to collect grimoires, and the versions produced for them are influenced by the customers. I like what Jake has to say here, and in truth, yes, the customers want, just as they do to this day, they want the demons. They want the knives and the yelling and the circles and the protocols, which is not for me to say that this is all wrong, but perhaps the approach needs to be examined. As Peter mentioned earlier, and as many scholars have said, these protocols, for the most part, come from an antagonistic, exorcistic view of spirits and demons. And while being something which we could qualify as a bully to these spirits using these books exactly the way that they want you to be used, might not yield the best results in this day and age. Things change. Times change. I think that is true of spiritual ecosystems as it is of human civilization or whatever this is supposed to be. Indeed, in my own interactions, and even if you were to read about the interactions that Julio had with things like the Ars Goetia, that's sometimes perhaps going to the more coercive or aggressive elements of evocation might not always be the best way of interacting with these specific spirits. The Grimoires, again, are a moment in time. And as Alexander Eth and myself have discussed in the Solomonic Magic episode, there is room to adapt. And I think adapt is not just in the idea of tools and the specific protocols, but also in the approach itself. Jake's essay, The Other Magician, closes with this sentiment. The grimoires are monuments of what may be called magic's interim period. They are disfigured by a dualism which was not originally native to Goetic tradition, but entered via the back door of changes in religion. Recognizing otherness as a characteristic magicians share with spirits enables us to surmount this abiding difficulty in Western magic. So again, departure from the grimoires, particularly the routine employment of coercive elements and dualistic models, is not a break with tradition. It is a return. I absolutely love that. Certainly the place where demons and infernal spirits have the most power is certainly in the imagination. The idea of nefarious acting entities is an astonishingly compelling one. Some part of us has always been fascinated with these spirits or these entities. Something about them truly speaks to something within us. Centuries ago, in the last decade of the 1200s, a physician and spiritual reformer by the name of Arnaud de Villanova, who no doubt was familiar with the sorts of ritual magic that was being done around him at the time. He diagnosed these sorcerers, these magicians, as having an actual medical affliction. He called it necromancer's disease. And he said that each and every one of them, the very fact that they were even attempting to do this kind of magic meant that they were melancholic. No doubt a very religious person. Arno sees only one excuse for people who believe that necromancy or nigromancy is technical and rational knowledge, is that they are ill. There's something wrong with them. To me, I find this interesting as it seems more symptomatic of a society or a culture which has such a binary view of how the world is apprehended on a personal, individual level. Demons are perhaps one of the best manifestations of this. Their story is indeed our story in some way, and no matter which way that you conceptualize them, there is always some kind of relational attribute that you can glean. Let's say you take the idea, the Christian conception of demons as fallen angels. Well, then they're in good company because we ourselves, humans, are outcasts too. Familiarizing yourself with how demons have been conceptualized and interacted with throughout the centuries, and particularly here in the West, is real medicine. It, in a way, cures the ignorant ills that they themselves are said to be responsible for. The things that I myself interact with don't seem to be demons, not in the way that I understand them, but I do think they're real. And I believe they do have a very specific space. I think the demon sees the hubris of humanity and all of our accomplishments as great as we see them. And so these demons dwell in the realms of uncertainty. We ourselves do truly demonic things when we are uncertain. We need to be certain, or else things fall apart. Or so we tell ourselves. If indeed the basest human emotion is that of fear, and that there is no greater fear than the unknown, I would change that last little bit to say the unknowing. It is here that I think the demon is most real, within that popular consciousness of the realm of not knowing, of uncertainty, and it beckons us to do the irrational, the illogical, and the cruel, especially as we fear the judgment of others. Sometimes these acts are done on an individual level, sometimes as a collective. The fear of not knowing turns a society demonic, although that's a term that I try not to use very often myself. Once upon a time, a public intellectual wrote a book warning of the demon haunted world and fearing a return to it. The only thing keeping the darkness away of this demon haunted world is a candle, and that candle itself is science. If only it was that easy. There is no return to a demon haunted world. We're still here. It hasn't gone anywhere. The parameters are just a little bit different. My penchant for seeing the world as being alive and attributing personhood to things which might be seen as inanimate to other people, particularly the ones supposedly holding this candle. None of this, none of the things that I hold to be sacred, none of the spirits which I have taken into my confidence should scare people. I see the acts of demons and their wrath, their influence, as active, lurking in the nepotistic halls of academia. The corrosiveness of unknowing and uncertainty is present in laboratories. It's there, I know you see it, flickering in the teleprompters for those who stand at podiums. The demon-haunted world continues apace. What's to do? Where's the exorcism? The only thing I can offer is that of which I've offered myself. And that is just to be content with not knowing. I don't have answers for everything. I have very few answers for what occurs in my life. And that's okay. I don't need to hastily make any rash decisions because I am uncertain of everything. Indeed, I am a seeker. The world is mysterious to me. It is an ongoing process of seeking and discovery, which enchants my world. If both the hyper religious as well as the fundamentally materialist would point a finger at me and say, "You, what you are doing, this journey into the unknown, this mystery that you call seeking, this uncertainty of existence, is demonic. You are trafficking with demons," then I guess they're right. All I would say back is, they're certainly better company than you are. So that is about all I have for this episode. Well, for now, obviously. Again, I've mentioned how I would probably like to do an episode about Christian demonology, as well as perhaps demonic possession. There's a lot with those two topics, and particularly demonic possession. There's some very interesting stuff to talk about there. But before that happens, I'm going to let you, the listeners, sit with this one for a little bit. Have to admit, this one was a bit of a trial for me. This episode was a lot of work, and there was a lot of stuff that I wanted to include in here, and then I ended up cutting it. Anyhow, that's just how it goes for these solo episodes that I do, but I really hope that you enjoyed this one as much as the UFO one and as much as some of my other solo episodes. I find them fun. I really enjoy them, and in a way, they're kind of a bit like the Patreon episodes that I do. So, yeah, let's just start. Well, how about this for a segue? Here you go. If you like what I'm doing here at What Magic Is This, and you want to support me, then there's a couple of ways of doing that, but the best way of doing that is through my Patreon. That is patreon.com/whatmagicisthis, or head to whatmagicisthis.com and click on any number of the Patreon buttons there. There's a lot of them. I litter my whole website all over the place with support me on Patreon, because I want you to support me on Patreon. This is my job. This is what I do for a living. I love it. Some days, most days, I say most days I love it. It is a lot of work, and sometimes it really, sometimes it gets pretty hectic, but for the most part, I have next to no complaints. But the only way that I can continue to do this as a job is with your support. And guess what? It's Patreon. It's only $7 a month. That's nothing. That will buy you, 2 bags of chips. That'll buy you a fancy cocktail at your favorite cocktail place. That's what they call them, right? Cocktail places? A bar. At your favorite bar. Wow, for somebody who worked at bars his entire life, it's how I forget the name of these things. Pub. They're called pubs as well. You can go to a pub and get a fancy cocktail, I'm sure. Anyhow, $7, that's nothing. That is so little. But yes, I do need your support to keep this going. What do I have on Patreon? Oh man, lots of episodes. I actually talk quite a bit about demons and Solomonic magic on my Patreon. As well, I have a whole episode about the Hygromantia, and you can head to the Patreon to listen to that one. I love that episode. I think that episode is fantastic. I also have episodes about Goetia and how that pertains to Western magic, and videos about how to do certain things. I just released a video that is a bit of an unboxing of the brand spanking new Austin Osman Spare Tarot deck that was released by Strange Attractor. I was part of the Kickstarter. I know quite a few of you were as well, and so I got mine in the mail last week, and I shared an unboxing of it, and it was fun. It was 41 minutes of me looking through these cards. I think it is something special, and I just thought that I would share my initial reaction to them. So that's there on Patreon as well. So many great episodes. I think my best work is on the Patreon, so if you could see your way to supporting me there, that would be greatly appreciated. If you don't like doing the whole support on Patreon, paying the monthly fee kind of thing, guess what? I also have a PayPal account. Just click on any number of the PayPal buttons on whatmagicisthis.com, and you can throw me $5, $10, $20, $2,000. Any amount helps. It all goes back into making this podcast run. It keeps the What Magic Is This hamster on the What Magic Is This wheel, so to speak. It keeps the What Magic Is This log in the What Magic Is This fireplace. Yes, and all of that kind of stuff. It all goes back into paying for hosting fees for the podcast and the website and all the plugins I used for editing and all of that sort of thing. Each and every dollar put there, it just helps me run this podcast. So if you could support that way, I would greatly appreciate it as well. The final way of supporting me is to show your support by grabbing some merchandise. Head to whatmagicisthis.com, click on the menu button there. It'll take you straight to my store. It's run through TeePublic. You can get mugs, you can get t-shirts, you can get hoodies, you can get babies clothing. You can get tote bags. You can get laptop cases, phone cases. There's so many things. It's all wonderful. Stickers. I've got stickers. I literally just put a sticker on something the other day on one of my surf skates, on a skateboard. I love my stickers. I think they're fantastic. I don't think they have notebooks anymore, which is a real shame because the notebooks were the absolute best. I don't see a ton of money from the merchandise. Most of it goes to the people producing it. That would be TeePublic. But I love seeing people wearing my stuff. So that is a pretty cool way of showing your support. And send me a picture if you got a t-shirt or something like that. I love seeing those out in the wild, so to speak, because it's really cool. I never thought that this sort of thing would happen when I started my podcast nearly 5 years ago. So again, I don't see a ton of money from that, but it's lovely when you do grab some merchandise. But the place that I really want to see you is Patreon. $7 American. That's very little. Hop on there. You get so many exclusive offerings from me. Access to a Discord server that is very lively and quite wonderful, and everybody there is very nice. You can ask me questions, and I'll answer them with little video replies. Seriously, I do that. I know a lot of people are familiar with Discord, but I'm one of the only people that I know that do video responses in real time to your magical questions. So that's one of the major perks of joining the Patreon, as well as you get to pick what kind of episodes I do. This Demons and Infernal Spirits episode, that was picked by the Patreon supporters. They're on Patreon. So yes, indeedy, Patreon is the best way of making me continue to do this thing that I love to do and that you seem to love to listen to, but I just need your support. Any help would be appreciated, and I would be eternally grateful. But this was an interesting episode, a lot of research. There's a lot of places I could have gone for this episode, and I'm sure some of you were like, Doug, you didn't talk about this one thing to do with demons and magic. Either I've talked about it on the Patreon or I might talk about it a little bit further on down the line. Remains to be seen. But what I will say is that if you need further context on the idea of demons and all of these things that I've talked about today, my goodness, I've got some awesome show notes for you at whatmagicisthis.com. Just head there, click on the episodes, hit the demons button there, the little link there. Man, the show notes for this episode are fantastic. There are some really great areas to go and to explore. Please do so. But all of these things that I've talked about in this last little bit here, all of it is available at whatmagicisthis.com. All right, that's the Demons and Infernal Spirits episode, and trust me, this is not the last time I'm going to be talking about this kind of stuff, because, as I said, not only is it fundamental to the development of Western ritual magic, it's pretty much fundamental to Western society and cultures in general. So thank you so much for joining me and allowing me to talk at you for the last 2 hours. I really hope you enjoyed this episode. I had a ton of fun, for the most part, making it. I would love for you to come on back to What Magic Is This as we delve deeper into the uncertain realms that I find so fascinating and that has been such an enormous part of my life for all of my life, and I hope the same goes for you. All right, everyone, I want you to stay healthy, to stay hopeful, and to stay luminous. Until next time, ta for now. Bye-bye.